This week on AgriView, we start beyond our borders. In Zimbabwe, there's excellent news coming out, which is that their maize production is double what they harvested last year. You remember last year, we were hit by the bad midsummer drought, which led to devastation in Zimbabwe's maize production and elsewhere in Southern Africa. But this time around, they see a recovery. The key question then, is that maize enough to cover their annual needs, or will they remain a net importer? Another important topic that is worth exploring is the food security conditions in the African continent. We know that the USAID has cut their budget, and one thing we haven't appreciated is how much USAID funds the World Food Program, which has played an important role in stabilizing food supply in a number of African countries. What does this mean now, and what can African countries do to boost their domestic agricultural production? And of course, we wouldn't end the segment without looking at the positive news here at home, which reflects that the sentiment among the South African agribusinesses and the farmers remain fairly positive, which means that the folks are working. Yes, we have problems, but they continue to invest, and the South African agricultural economy remains on stable footing. – 2024 was a tough season in Southern Africa. We were hit by the midsummer drought, which led to a decline in maize production across a number of countries. Here at home in South Africa, we lost over 20% of our grain harvest. But in some countries, conditions were worse. Think about Zambia. They lost roughly half of their maize production. But in Zimbabwe, the maize production declined by roughly 60%. So it was very tough, and that led to a major maize imports that were required in the country in order for them to be able to stabilize the food supplies. But this time around, it looks like they are having an excellent season. And of course, this is similar to what we are seeing all over. Some of you that follow our conversation, you may recall in the earlier segments, we talked about the recovery in maize production in Zambia. In South Africa, the crop is also looking reasonably well. In Zimbabwe, their maize production could actually reach about 1.3 million tons. Now, this is up significantly from what they produced last year, because last year they had a crop of around 600,000 tons. Now, balancing all of these numbers up, you need to know how much they need a year. Zimbabwe consumes about 2 million tons a year, which means then that even now, with the crop having recovered from 600,000 tons to an expected 1.3 million tons, they will still need to import about 700,000 tons in order for them to have sufficient supplies for their maize production. But lucky for Zimbabwe, because the neighboring countries like South Africa have excellent harvest, and I think South Africa will still be in a position to export just over 2 million tons of maize, because the maize production in South Africa is over 14 million tons. And of course, South Africa needs about 11.8 or so million tons, so there will still be sufficient supplies. But this means then that in Zimbabwe, we did not see the recovery that we would have liked. Everyone wants Zimbabwe to be self-sufficient at some point. And if you may ask me then to say, what is the difference? Why did Zimbabwe not see a full recovery as what we had seen, for example, in South Africa? It all boils down to a number of things. I think the issue of seed cultivars that they use, as well as the fertilizer usage in Zimbabwe, which continues to be fairly slow, that does affect the yields that they actually end up getting. And of course, even the area they planted for maize was not as large as what they typically plant. So balance of all of those aspects contributed to this recovery in maize production that is not yet there, which leaves them still a net importer of maize. And I know now some of you will say, can we trust these numbers? Because the Zimbabwean government is known for being quite economical with the truth. But don't worry, these numbers are not coming from the Zimbabwean government per se. They are coming from the United States Department of Agriculture. And yes, the United States Department of Agriculture, not in Washington, right here in Pretoria, they have actually good scientists that go out there and estimate the crops. And they've been doing this for quite some time. And we've learned in in the past that their data is actually solid. And this is what they released here in June, and saying this is what they are seeing on the ground upon surveying the crop. We will, of course, reconcile these numbers with what we will hear from the Zimbabwean government, but we gain enough confidence on what we are hearing from them releasing at this point. And I think if you are sitting in South Africa, the core thing then that we have to think about is that in the demand from the region, Zimbabwe will likely be one of the countries that will continue buying maize from South Africa. And in fact, even in the current marketing year that started in May, the 2025-26 grain marketing year, particularly for maize, if you look at the exports out of South Africa, yes, it's not much. It's still just under 200,000 tons that we have exported. But Zimbabwe accounted for roughly half of that, which shows you then that the demand that we saw in Zimbabwe last year for grain, it will continue again this year. But what will be different this time around, I do think that for the coming months, Zimbabweans will rely on some of the maize that they produce by themselves. It is only towards the end of the year where you will start seeing Zimbabwe importing more and more of larger volumes to supplement their domestic needs. That is part of that 700,000 tons that I think it will be a shortfall. But South Africa will not be the only game in town this time around. I mean, Zambia, they had their excellent harvest, and I think they will be back to be the net exporter of maize. And the Zimbabweans can buy from Zambia or buy from South Africa, which then puts the whole region in a far better place when it comes to food supplies, at least over the near to medium term. But of course, the Africa story doesn't end there. One of the discussions that we haven't reflected on is this idea of the entire African continent to say, what will happen with our low agricultural productivity? Because there are a lot of studies that are showing that if you look at the agricultural productivity in the continent, you take away the Maghreb region up in North Africa, you take away South Africa as well as Zambia, and you look in the number of countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region, it is clear that much of the increase in output for grain that we have seen has actually been because of the expansion in area plantings rather than the heavy improvement or the higher improvement in terms of yields. Now we have to ask a question then of saying, what is it? How can we actually see an improvement in yields? Yes, the fertilizer usage is one of the key aspects. There's a low fertilizer usage generally in a number of African countries. I mean, you can look at the data on this, on how this looks. On average, in South Africa, on grain production, we probably use around 90 kilograms per hectare. In much of the African continent, excluding Zambia, it's around 18, 19 kilograms per hectare. Zambia around between 50 and 60 kilograms per hectare. But in the developed markets, in terms of agriculture now undeveloped, think about the US, think about South America. In those countries, they use as much as around 120 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. Now, fertilizer per se, of course, it balances the nutrients that the soils needs, but it also helps us in ensuring that we don't till more area in order to get the yields that we need for our maize supplies, but rather we improve the output that we can get. That is the one aspect. The second aspect, it lies on the idea that as the African continent, we are not embracing technology enough. South Africa is one of the few and the only country that has actually embraced the better genetics in terms of grain production. As early as 2001, we adopted the genetically modified seeds in terms of maize and soybean production. You can argue whether that has contributed a particular percentage in output or not, but the message is clear. Back then, we were getting about 2 tons per hectare in the output of maize. Right now, we are over, on average, dry land, over 6 tons per hectare on maize production. One of the contributing factors on that is the idea that we are using these seed cultivars. That has contributed to this place where South Africa sits now as food secure at a national level, and of course, a net exporter when it comes to grain and the other crops. So we have to lean on technology, especially at the moment where climate change is a big challenge, and we need to ensure that agriculture can adapt in this challenging environment. And I think the only way of making sure that we adapt, amongst other things that can be applied, is leaning on the technology. Now, the African governments can do something about this, because when it comes to seed cultivars, there are some cultivars that are not permitted to be planted in these countries, which is why I think even in conversations like what South Africa will be having later this year on the G20, on the food security work stream, we have to talk about embracing technology to boost agricultural productivity in the African continent. But there are other themes that are important for unlocking investment in agriculture in Africa. And I think one of those is ensuring that we embrace title deeds and ensure that we strengthen and improve land governance in the African continent. Now, again, if you take away South Africa, you look at the sub-Saharan Africa region, you realize that a number of countries in rural or farmland is still really sitting in an informal area. I mean, there's been work that was published quoting a certain studies by The Economist magazine, and they made the point that roughly 90% of rural land in sub-Saharan Africa region, excluding South Africa, is pretty much untitled and it's informal. Now, if we are thinking about agribusinesses bringing funds in there and the farmers expanding and investing, we have to improve land governance. It's part and parcel of the conversation that we must have. And I think it is important that all of these conversations happen now, because for a long time, when we were hit by the drought and the national disasters, we leaned on receiving a bit of aid. And one of those organizations, again, was the USAID that provided support. They provided support directly, but sometimes through the World Food Program. Now with the USAID under pressure because of the US administration that has said that they don't want to spend as much on USAID, that does put the World Food Program at risk. In fact, they have said as much in some of their recent statements. Now then we have to ask ourselves, if the World Food Program is not as strong as in the past, what does that mean for much of the African continent? And I think the only way to insulate ourselves out of this is ensure that we improve our own agricultural productivity and output as the continent. And that starts with the issue of land governance. It continues into the investments on embracing technology, because all of that attracts the investments to come in the sector. But there's another thing here that we must have a conversation about. Their consistent intervention into agricultural markets when there are minor disasters. We can have droughts, but that doesn't mean that the governments should jump in and say no more exports of particular products by the period we are having drought. We're trying to cushion households. I don't think that's a policy approach we should take, because what that does, it disincentivizes the farmers as well as the agribusinesses and the others that are investing in the sector. In South Africa, we have a saying which says, the cure for higher prices is higher prices, because what that does, it invokes people to invest more in the sector and make sure that there's optimism in the sector, and ultimately that leads to an improvement in the agricultural production. And I think as the African continent, we must lean in on that. And there are a number of these examples about what we can learn, where can we pick that. And I think the best and one of the key starting points has to be in South Africa to say, what is it that South Africa is doing? And how can we take some of these lessons and replicate them in some of the African continent? And of course, each country has a different dynamic. We won't take everything out of South Africa and put it in Gambia and put it in Ghana. No. We will consider what is necessary for Ghana, we'll consider what has worked in South Africa, and then see what lessons can be shared. Because South Africa, by the way, has a lot to learn from the African continent, because we remain a country of two agricultures. Yes, we have this prosperous side of agriculture that I'm talking about, but we also have a smallholder side of agriculture that is still on the back foot in terms of development. Maybe we can learn something from Kenya, we can learn something from Uganda, which is why then this knowledge sharing, which I think at the G20 platform that we are hosting this year as South Africa, should open up a dialogue for such conversations to happen. Because Africa's agricultural output and productivity must improve in order for us not to run into difficult headways, because no one is coming to save us. The World Food Program that for so many years has assisted, I am beginning to be in doubt about its stability to do that. And I think that the continent, it's only right that we do this. The other aspect that will also assist us. We must never forget that we spend over 80 billion US dollars as the continent each year importing food. And about 45 billion of that is actually the sub-Saharan Africa region. So if we begin increasing our own agricultural productivity, we also deal with that food import bill that is beginning to be a challenge for the continent. Those are all of the dynamics that I think are important. But hey, I can't sit here lecturing about the continent and what's going wrong. There are some positive news in South Africa, and I think it's only right that we signal those. We have something that is called the Agbiz Agribusiness Confidence Index, which is the sentiment indicator about how South African farmers and the agribusinesses are feeling about the ways of doing business in South Africa. This index, we measure it from 0 to 100 like any other index. It's a composite index. And I tell you what, since the start of this year, it has been showing that there's optimism in the sector. In fact, in the first quarter, it jumped to 70 points, which is well above the 50 index point where we measure and consider any point that is below that as pessimism, above that as optimism. It was at 70. In the second quarter, it declined a bit to 65 points. Yes, the decline is not something that we desire, but 65 is still an excellent point, and it indicates that there's optimism in the South African agricultural sector. The decline is because of the aspects that we have discussed in this conversation. One of that being the unpredictable and intensified and tense geopolitical and the geo-economical tensions that everyone has been observing, especially in that area of the Middle East as well as in the Black Sea. And of course, trade policy, since the US started off in its tariff wars, that is another aspect that the respondents of this index have indicated. And of course, the foot and mouth disease as well as all of the animal diseases and biosecurity remains a major issue, and they contributed to that decline in this confidence. But at 65 points is still optimistic, and it signals that the favorable rainfalls that we have received are supporting our grain, oilseeds, and horticulture production. And that puts the South African agricultural sector on good footing, at least this year. Yes, it won't be a wide-scale, excellent recovery. It will be an uneven recovery, but it signals that things are still looking up for many subsectors in this agricultural economy of this country. And yes, thank you so very much for following these conversations, and do follow us across all socials and subscribe to our YouTube channel.